Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I just want to point out that this photo was taken maybe 8 years ago. And if anyone notices anything, my style hasn't changed, and that's kind of depressing. Hello, I'm Katie. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at Aston, and I'm so honoured to be invited to talk at the Philosopher's Yard. I'm born and bred Brummie, and I'd never heard of it before, and it's so fantastic to see so many of you here. And it's also such an honour to follow such wonderful poetry, so thank you for that as well. So yeah, I'm going to talk about nationalism, and hopefully I'm going to give you a bit of a kind of overview of the debate on nationalism and what it looks like, and kind of different positions that might feed into some later discussion as well. So I thought we'd start by getting you to think. I wondered whether people would be willing to call out anything that comes to mind when they see this image. What does it make them think of? Colonialism. Okay, yeah, good. Anyone else?
Raise the flag group.
What was this?
Raise the flag, raise the colour.
Raise the colours movement. So the kind of past summer of flags, as people have started to perhaps call it, of people kind of raising. Fish and chips, yeah, good. Someone else said something over here that I didn't quite catch. Oppression, okay, great. Anything else? Aldi. Brilliant. I mean, anyone else wants to call anything else? Yeah? Sports, yeah, absolutely. Sports teams. Sorry. Buckingham Palace, yeah, so royalty and institutions, yeah. So hopefully what this might have illustrated is the breadth of ways in which we relate to a nation, whether we feel nationalist sentiment to that country or not, whether we're nationals of that country or not. There are certain, I suppose, feelings and ideas that come with a national symbol, and that's kind of key to what I want to explore tonight, this idea that actually we all come to nationalism from such a diversity of perspectives, and one object or symbol can mean something to us and mean something quite different to the next person. And so understanding nationalism as something that we live and something that we relate to in lots of different ways, I think is really, really important. All right, so what is a nation then? It's quite tricky to define in many ways. We might just take it as a given. We might actually just think, well, a nation's a nation. Why are you asking me that? I know how I feel about the country that I live in, or I understand what we mean when we talk about nations. But actually, there are lots of different ways of understanding what a nation is. I think what they all kind of have in common is this idea of like a collective allegiance to a territorial political entity, so a state. Right? So we have the nation, and then we have the nation state, and the nation is this kind of idea of loyalty and allegiance to a people. And it kind of comes historically from this idea that we would have like allegiance to a territory rather than an individual. So this shift from ideas about religion and monarchy towards the territory and the state, and this idea of collective membership of a place. And so it's really about ideas. It's not necessarily about things that exist in reality. And there's different opinions on that, I guess. So there is an idea of like the ethnic nation. And so the idea here is that there is something real that binds people together, and that it's about like bloodlines, and it's about inheritance, and it's about who your ancestors are. And that would be like the ethnic definition of a nation. And then against that, people sort of talk about the civic definition of a nation, which is more about identifying with institutions and democracy, and thinking about like what binds us together as something more like human rights, for example, and these kinds of things that aren't necessarily about some kind of shared bloodline. Those ideas are kind of contested. I think the ethnic one in particular, because that relies on us thinking that things like bloodlines are real. and also thinking about like race as something that's real. And actually increasingly people think about race as something that's constructed. Again, that's like an imagined category based on like perceived social characteristics. So some of those ideas are quite contested as well. But the point is that there are different ways of imagining what a nation is. There are lots of different ways of thinking about what a nation is in different ways. I've quoted Renan, because why not? In his work, What is a Nation? Says, our sense of shared values and our collective affirmation of such values is what constitutes a nation. So Renan, I think, really invokes that more like civic idea of what a nation is, that we can share values and have things in common, and that is the root of what makes us a shared nation. Okay, so if we know what a nation is, then what is nationalism? I'm going to refer here to Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, which when people want to talk about nationalism, they pretty much always go to Benedict Anderson and say, okay, let's define nationalism. And it is quite helpful. It is quite a useful way of thinking about what nationalism is. And Anderson basically says that nationalism is an imagined community. So he's saying it's not like a real community. It's something that we have to imagine. So why does he say that? Well, you don't know everyone in a nation, and you never would, unless you lived in the tiniest nation in the world. You declare your back garden to be a new nation, then maybe you would. But generally speaking, you're never going to know everyone in your nation. And so it has to be imagined. You have to imagine bonds with people, and you have to imagine that you all share in some kind of common project, that you all share the same kind of loyalties. And so it really depends on you imagining that. We don't know right now who's living in Cornwall. We don't know who's living in Manchester. We know kind of who's in this room, but we have to imagine that these bonds exist and that we're all part of this one nation. So it has to be based on imagination. And it's also based in ideas of sameness. So in some way that we're all the same. Now, I've just said we could define that in lots of different ways. We could think about ancestry and so forth. We could think about values. We could think about institutions. There's lots of different things. We could think about Aldi or fish and chips and cultural stuff. There's lots of different things that would bring us together, but it's all about imagining those things that we have in common and the things that are important to us. And in many ways, that's why nationalism is so contested, because of course, we all imagine the nation to mean different things, and it means different things to all of us, depending on who we are and how we're positioned in society. So nationalism then becomes about loyalty, about allegiance, about belonging. And I suppose it's a project that people buy into to different extents. And again, people in this room, I think, as Dan outlined in the introduction, will have very different views and a very different kind of buy-in to these allegiances. But again, it's about imagining that we share in this project. But the other side to that is that nationalism could then be a tool of social control, right? Because if we buy into this allegiance, and if there's like one dominant way of thinking what this allegiance should look like, what happens when you don't buy into that? What happens when you don't share the same idea of nationalism? What happens when you see the British state as caught up in colonialism? What happens when you don't buy in to the vision that is being pushed to you? How are you then positioned within that nation? And what does that mean for how you're included in that society and the kind of life you can live? So thinking about nationalism as like this tool of social control, I think is potentially quite interesting. And I want to think about nationalism for the rest of what I'm going to say in this kind of debate between whether nationalism could be inclusive or whether it always has to involve some kind of exclusion. So does nationalism have exclusion baked in? Does it always exclude? Or could we imagine nationalism to mean something more inclusive? Okay, so to talk about inclusive nationalism then, there's a few different kind of definitions of what we mean by inclusive nationalism, but the one I thought I'd focus on today is liberal nationalism, which is like an increasingly dominant way of thinking about nationalism. And I suppose it's like a third way between the ethnic and the civic nationalism that I mentioned before, right? So we've got the ethnic nationalism, it's all about ancestry. We've got the civic nationalism that's all about values and what binds us together. Liberal nationalism's kind of in between those, and it really focuses on culture and what culture is and what we mean by a national culture and what that could involve. And people who support liberal nationalism would say that nationalism is really, really important to all of the things that in a country like the UK we hold really dear. They would say it's really important to democracy, and they would say it's really important to the welfare state. And the reasons that they say this are that they say we have to trust each other. What are we going to do if we can't trust each other? So if you're going to run a democracy and you're going to expect people to vote in that democracy and that then they might vote and their team might lose, if you're going to expect people to accept that that will happen, then you need some kind of buy-in to a national project, because that involves trust and it involves allegiance and it involves this idea that you're all part of a common project. And so they would argue that without nationalism, none of that would work. We wouldn't have this idea that we're one society together. We just wouldn't buy into that. And they say the same thing about the welfare state. They say, would people pay their taxes? Would people do this stuff? Would they support the welfare state if they didn't trust that others would do the same? If they didn't have that idea that they were all part of a common project, would they trust each other to do that? And so they say that nationalism really, really matters from that perspective. And they come back to the idea of culture. So they shy away from the ethnic nationalism stuff, but they really focus in on culture and say there are these common things that matter to all of us that should bind us together. And so that might be language and speaking a common language, but for some liberal nationalists, it's more than that. It's thicker ideas of culture. What can bind us? Is it things like the national flag? Is it sporting success? Is it the foods we eat? What are the things that can bind us together, that can help us to imagine we're in a community together when we might be hundreds and hundreds of miles apart? What is the thing that can bring us together? So I guess that's the kind of liberal approach to nationalism. So I'm not going to really outline a very kind of exclusionary nationalism, because I think we all kind of know what that would look like. But I think increasingly this is the kind of nationalism that people are trying to argue for and are trying to make the case that nationalism matters. It's for these kinds of reasons. We don't get much kind of philosophical or sociological defense of like very extreme forms of nationalism. I think that kind of movement has shifted and ended, at least in kind of philosophical debates, obviously not necessarily in the real world that we live in, but it is the liberal nationalism that people would argue, yeah, you know, you can say that nationalism's exclusive, but we need nationalism. We need it to support our institutions, to support our democracy. What do we do if we can't imagine that we're all part of one community? It all falls apart. So that would be the kind of inclusive nationalism argument. But then others would argue, actually, doesn't nationalism have exclusion baked in to some extent? Isn't there always some element of exclusion baked into nationalism? And they argue this from a variety of perspectives. So a key, I suppose, key to all of those is that nationalism produces boundaries between insiders and outsiders, and that it has to do this to function. So it has to have an us and it has to have a them. And this is like distinguishing between particular and universal, right? So you've got the universal, you've got the general, everybody in the world. But if you want to make something more particular, then that involves excluding people. It has to, by definition, you have to exclude people. So if you draw the boundaries of a country, then you are automatically excluding people from that country. And so we see this in lots of ways with nationalism. We see it at the border, where people are stopped from coming into the country, where people are unable or might be able to come into the country but have less rights than other people. So not being able to bring family members, or only being able to stay for a short amount of time, or having to leave when they lose a job. All these different ways that distinguish between who are the real nationals of that country and who are people who don't belong to that country. So all these ways of distinguishing these boundaries and who is us and who is them. And we increasingly see this in everyday life as well. So there are lots of different places that the border will encroach in everyday life to distinguish who counts and who doesn't. So, for example, increasingly with the NHS in this country, there are borders, there are different policies for different people. Increasingly, if you want to rent a house in this country, there are different borders for different people. Suddenly you will come up against a range of things that might prevent you or make it more difficult for you to rent. In my line of work, now all the students have to tap in their cards, and that's a bordering practice because for international students, it means something very different to home students. So there are lots of different ways that the border comes into our lives. And it also matters not just for people who are migrants, but for people who are citizens, but are somehow labelled as other. So we can think of this in terms of race, and we can see how, for example, if you go and you want to rent a house, you are less likely to be allowed to rent that house if the landlord thinks that you might not have a full British citizenship, because it would be more work for that landlord to go away and do the checks that they need to do to make sure that you're allowed to rent the house. So we know that these things impact on people, not just because they're actually migrants, but also because they're being labelled as somehow outsiders. And we also only have to look to things like the Windrush scandal to see how quickly rugs can be pulled from underneath people's feet and suddenly they're labelled as outsiders through changes in policy. So that idea of boundaries between insiders and outsiders is like a logic in a way that nationalism rests on, but it's also something that manifests in real life, and we can see it happening all the time in this country, but also I'm sure you can all think of other examples from around the world as well. Another argument here is that nationalism is based on myths of belonging that don't reflect our lived experiences and perhaps never have either. So actually the myths that we tell ourselves to imagine this community are one person's myths of the nation, but are they the reality of how we as Britons or of any country live together? Is that really the reality on the ground? Are people who are marching through the streets talking about an England lost, for example, over the past year? Did that England really ever exist? Have we not often all just rubbed along as a multicultural society? But the powerful myths are the ones that hold with nationalism and that define, again, between who really belongs and who might be positioned as the outsider. So myths can be really powerful, but they can also be really dangerous, particularly where they're promoted by the elites of society who hold power and have that power to distinguish who counts from who doesn't. And also often that is manifested within institutions, and that can also have really negative effects as well. So yeah, myths really matter. And I think with exclusive nationalism, I think it is kind of coming back to that idea that, you know, can we really talk about something being inclusive when it has to rest on excluding people? It can't exist without excluding people. How could we ever kind of marry those two things together? Another thing just to think about with the ways in which nationalism excludes is that we have to think about how nationalism is about allegiance to a state, but not all nations are allied to states. Not all nations have self-determination through a state. So there are nations without states, and there are people who belong to these nations who are stateless. And they're positioned as the ultimate outsiders. They have no recourse to any kind of political institution. But the logic of nationalism will keep those people excluded. And I've kind of included a few flags here. Does anybody know the flags?
Kurdistan.
Yeah, so Kurdistan, Palestine. Yeah, so there are arguments for many people that Sikhism is a nation, that Sikhs are a nation. without a state, again relating to kind of history in the Punjab and common language and those kinds of things. So there are nations that exist without states, and so we have to then think about that level as well, as to how nationalism excludes people kind of permanently from any kind of political institution, and the consequences of that for their lives as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention about nationalism, does anyone have a guess about where this is? Where? Okay, it's not in Birmingham. I should have made that really clear. It's nowhere near Birmingham. It is Northern Ireland, yes, it's Belfast. And obviously nationalism is, I'm not going to even begin to talk about Northern Ireland in relation to nationalism in the short time I've got left. But I think the reason I wanted to include this picture is because nationalism is also territorial. And what we can see from Northern Ireland is the way that flags work to mark territories, and how they have been used at a very local community level to decide who belongs and who doesn't. And there's some really interesting work going on at the moment to think about how this might apply in England at the moment, and the way in which flags are being used to mark territories and to say who might belong and who doesn't, and whether that might be a replay to some extent, albeit in a very different context, of what we saw in Northern Ireland, and how those divisions came about, and how territories became marked as unionist or republican, and how, you know, that really shaped community life there and drove exclusion and violence as well. Ugh, this isn't working. I'm just going to have to hope for the best. I might just turn around. Okay, so yeah, and then I think there's a really interesting relationship of racism to nationalism, which is perhaps maybe misunderstood at large. Racism and nationalism are often really, really closely aligned. Again, I'm sure we can all think of so many examples at the moment as to how racism and nationalism come into play with one another, and not just in the UK as well. But research in the UK then shows that there is this kind of underlying ambivalence about racism in the UK, and that it kind of underlies everything, and that actually, you know, it's there waiting to be mobilised. And obviously, given what we've seen over the past year, that's quite an interesting idea, that there is this layer of latent racism that could quite easily be mobilised into something quite a lot more dangerous. But interestingly, racism can take really different forms for different groups of people. So what research has shown is that imperial nationalism is more common among affluent and well-educated people. And by imperial racism, yeah, sorry, I've made a mistake on those slides. Imperial racism. What I mean by imperial racism is a kind of racism that's very much rooted in like ideas of empire, colonialism, and those kind of racist hierarchies. That has been found to be much more common among like elite, so more wealthy people, better educated people. Whereas anti-establishment racism and nationalism has been seen to be more common among working classes. So that idea that actually working class people often feel very anti-establishment, and that is mobilised into some kind of racist nationalism. So I think that's quite interesting when we think about who is mobilising racism in relation to nationalism, and why, and how they kind of interact.